United States overtook Britain in economic terms around the turn of the 20th century and started its own golden age. With broadly open borders and a welcome to all who came, America built a unique identity as a nation, in part through tolerance of race and religion, tolerance of culture and of language, and partly through freedom of trade and freedom for the individual American. A friend of mine recently drew me to a wonderful poem by Emma Lazarus in praise of this American inclusiveness of spirit, as enshrined in the Statue of Liberty with her great verse, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And partly, America's capability was built on its own geographical self-sufficiency. As a vast continent in its own right, it had enough land for all, with one or two minor exceptions, such as rare earths, of which more later. It found it was self-sufficient in all areas of manufacture and commerce. And finally, paying a special heed to what Teddy Roosevelt said in a speech in Chicago in 1903, America did indeed speak softly and could at the same time carry an increasingly big stick. By the end of World War II, it had a mighty war machine that was capable of policing the world and furthering its own jealously held views on democracy, on freedom, and the unstoppable power of small government and private capitalism. By the mid-80s, more than a decade after its pullout from Vietnam, the United States had 500,000 on active service abroad and 65,000 more afloat. A total, incidentally, more than the total deployment of the equivalent forces of the British Empire at the height of its power nearly a century earlier. Today, the United States remains the preeminent country in the world. Wherever you look, this nation is a leading figure, and nothing I'm going to say in challenging its role in the future changes this position today. You still have, for example, 1.3 million on active service. In higher education, you are no less dominant. Of course, as a Brit, I'm ridiculously proud to tell you that my old alma mater, Oxford University, is rated number 1 in the world. But 15 of the remaining top 20 are from here in the United States. And perhaps the most trenchant test of all, most potential immigrants would like their new home to be here. However, in this talk, I'm going to ask you to recalibrate this great country with the immediate present and above all with the future in mind. I'm going to suggest that we may have to reappraise the role of leadership, of government, indeed of our ideas of what governing might mean, if we're to meet the challenge of the next era, and above all, if we're to develop tools to cope, because we no longer stand alone as the sole hyperpower. Some of my statistics may shock you, but I promise that as you listen, out of them will come a clear political and economic checklist for action and a means of prioritizing those actions. In the first place, whilst this nation remains strong, all is not hunky-dory. We're living in changing times, and for the most part, we, especially in the West, may be living on outdated thinking. Here are some thoughts for you. Luxembourg, with an average income per capita of $104,000. Luxembourg enjoys almost twice the standard of living we enjoy here, at an average of $55,000. Switzerland stands just ahead of us, at $59,000. Ireland and Norway have $69,000, and Singapore $90,000. We are, in fact, 11th in the World League tables, roughly on a par with the Netherlands. If we look more closely at the world we live in, the picture does not make happy reading. Japan, an important US ally in Asia, and until recently a poster child for economic miracles, is now an economic nightmare. Saddled with the largest debt obligations in the world, more than 1 quintillion yen, 2.5 times its entire economy. It now faces terminal decay. Despite bailouts, 22 of the 28 EU member states, including some of the largest, Spain, France, Italy, and the UK, are deeper in debt than ever before. All, with the exception of Germany, are experiencing 20% youth unemployment, a recipe for civil unrest. Add on top of this the challenge of refugees from the increasingly desertified North Africa and war-torn Middle East, and the potential for terrorism, and the polarization of politics in Europe becomes a real and present threat. As I will plead later, politics in this new, truly global world should no longer be a binary choice, black or white, good or bad. It should be at the very least an understood compromise, if you'll forgive me, between 50 shades of grey. But this is not what's happening. Instead, the pressures within Europe and the United States are polarising opinion. Intolerance, xenophobia, and short-term thinking are lurking at every rally. It is vastly to their credit that most elections across Europe have stepped back from a commitment to totalitarian government. But as with so much in Europe, the further east and south you look, the closer you get to Russia, the less the European experiment holds water. Here the poverty is the greater. The reliance on subsistence agriculture is greater. And the more disruptive are the Russian cyber attacks and fake news. If Japan is threatened, Europe is no less in real danger of falling apart. Britain is already clumsily leaving. There's talk of the French Frexit, a Greek Grexit. Many of the fringe states, formerly vassals to the USSR, are weak. Latvia has a GDP per head half that of us in the United States and dropping. Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania and Belarus are even worse off, with average incomes around $18,000. Albania and Bosnia, $11,000, and Ukraine stands or falters at $8,000. Lenin's bequest to communist Russia was to use any form of disruption in pursuit of a loveless, lifeless, and hopeless world state of Russian communism. So Putin, a Leninist if ever I saw one, cuts off gas to Poland in the midst of winter. I have a pause.
Now, I will say there is a tinge of glare in your glasses. It's about at the level it was on the last video. Did you notice it at all on the rest of it? Okay. I mean, it's very minor, but you can tell that if you're looking for it, you can see it. But otherwise, it doesn't affect the quality.
I'm going to go back a bit so you can...
Yeah. Yep.
Much of that landmass is of hollow value, being as it is above 60 degrees north and essentially part of the Arctic region. Its population, at 140 million, though large, is barely 40% of that of either the European Union or of us here in the United States. And its GDP per capita, at $26,000, half that of the United States. It sits below Greece in the international rankings, just above St. Kitts and Nevis. But Russia matters because it still seeks to disrupt events in Europe. It matters because it wants to rebuild its historic cordon sanitaire of satellite vassal states between its persecuted peoples and the vastly more fulfilled lives of Western Europeans. And at the end of the day, it matters because its current leader is no less a psychopathic despot than were Lenin and Stalin. And like them, he wants to extend his global reach if he can. Hence his dabbling in the Middle East and the face-slapping challenge he presents to the West in Crimea. He is testing the enemy, and the United States in particular. Putin revels in disruption. And finally, Russia matters here in the United States, insofar as our administration looks inept, having no coherent or workable strategy to marginalize it and its malevolent leadership. All this, and much more, plays out in real time on our iPhones, is talked up by the media, and only makes the role of governing the most powerful nation on earth the more challenging, and indeed opens the question as to whether our very political and government structures may not now be dangerously out of date. And I'm going to suggest you haven't heard anything yet, because it's not the Russians who are the threat. We're facing something else quite new, far more insidious, far more effective, in effect, an existential double whammy. In the first place, our role in the world is now under potentially terminal threat. I suspect we will never again be the sole hyperpower we were in the middle of the last century. Dealing well with this realization will be a major challenge in itself to our collective psyche, our ego, and to our politics. And if that were not enough, we're also going to have to find a way to learn new tricks, a new way of doing things, an entirely new take on how we manage ourselves and move on from the long-held but now misleading ways of governance and leadership. Absent this self-transformation in thinking, both at home and overseas, we may be at least half responsible for the next world war. The real challenge is not Russia, it is China. China has already emerged in some respects as an equivalent power, but it's done so much more. It's evolved a new and effective way of managing both its huge challenges at home and also its foreign policy abroad. It has grown with such speed and purpose that it has already threatened our history, and it may eclipse it. Above all, it has done this through a very different system of government from ours, one that systematically supports and strengthens its geo-economic power base in the world in a way that our much vaunted system of capitalist freedom, small government, and political indiscipline makes difficult, if not impossible. What worked before may no longer be the best game in town, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But first, a word about the nation with whom we have to find a fruitful accommodation. China has a rich history, and that will be disregarded at our peril. It's been the world's hyperpower uniquely not once, but twice before. First, in the days of the Tang dynasty around 700 BC, and then again with various twists and turns during the Ming dynasty of the 15th century. Humans have lived in China for more than 1.5 million years. Stone tools and the use of fire has been found dating back 1.3 million years. Modern-day China, however, can best be traced for our purposes to around 1000 BC, when the leader of what became the Zhou dynasty first pulled off the ultimate political coup and managed to persuade his people of the divine right of kings, what he called the mandate from heaven, with himself as the first beneficiary of this awesome legacy. As the nation grew, so there emerged a central, deeply respected bureaucracy founded on merit. The most talented directed and ruled a country that believed in Confucius, sought an orderly discipline in society, and where everyone knew and lived within their place. They prospered across many fronts. By 100 BC, Chinese mathematicians had developed linear algebra to a level not encountered in Europe till the late 18th century, nearly 2,000 years later. A Confucian order to society, a centralized meritocratic elite, mathematics, and of course fine art, ceramics, silks, and spices. And to these virtues the nation brought the expansion of mutually beneficial trade along the silk and spice road that linked China to Venice by both land and sea. The Silk Road took in the Pacific Islands, India, Persia, Arabia, East Africa, long before Columbus ever sailed from Europe. It would for centuries underpin cultural, economic, and political interaction throughout Eurasia. And it would do so whilst fostering coexistence. This was an early use of geoeconomics, which, coupled with the nation's formidable armies, led to the Tang dynasty becoming the world hyperpower starting around 700 AD. The great Tang name is that of Taizong, who brought together the warring Chinese, Mongolian and barbarian tribes to create the cosmopolitan melting pot that would become the bedrock of China today, and which legitimized his authority beyond the Great Wall itself. Most striking, perhaps, was Taizong's rhetoric and practice of tolerance. The peoples of the steppes are just human beings like us, he argued. Their needs are no different. A ruler's beneficence should extend to them without any racial hesitation. China's culture has developed over 3,000 years. Until 1966, the horrors of Mao and the Cultural Revolution, it managed to preserve its heritage, its 56 officially recognized disparate ethnic groups, its wide range of foods, and its mutually unintelligible languages. The relatively gentle creeds of Confucius and Buddha coexisted. In turning now to the present day, let me stress 4 aspects of China's vast and complex history that I've glossed over in this quick summary. First, the sheer numbers. Though not the largest country by land, it's nonetheless huge, much the same size as our nation, and like the United States, with a no less vast range of types of countryside. But what sets it apart is the scale of its population. 1.4 billion, 4 times that of the United States. Second, its sense of cultural heritage based on tolerance, knowing one's place, obedience to authority, and a bureaucracy founded on an educational elite. At its best, a combination of discipline, professionalism, and excellence. In this it perhaps resembles France with its Napoleonic Code and École Polytechnique, or perhaps Britain with its entrenched private schools, universities, and clubs. Thirdly, especially for our talks today, China developed mutually beneficial trade with the rest of Eurasia through the Silk Road. Where Britain, the hyperpower of the 19th century, built its empire, and the United States, the following hyperpower of the 20th century, built its preeminence, whereas these two thrived through what I've called elsewhere war, economics, slavery, and genocide, China exerted its influence through the management of its trade, through geoeconomics, and it largely avoided the American 20th century concern for moral posturing, for bringing democracy, freedom, and the American way of success to its vassal states. China simply didn't see the need to interfere with neighbours in that way. Around the start of the 21st century, China shook off the residue from Mao. We are now, 20 years later, looking at what by some measures is already the leading power on Earth and the only one still growing at 7% per annum. I suggest this may be the next hyperpower, certainly the nation to stand alongside the United States as part of a world duopoly, and it will continue to build on its major heritage, scale, an outstanding bureaucracy, and geoeconomic skill. I suggest it will build on these strengths in a way that we here, with our fragmented system of government, our short-term home and international habits, our system of politics in such confusion, will find impossible to resist. Let me quickly bring China up to date. Let's just look at what a much derided, different approach to government and leadership has in fact achieved. In a single generation, a nation that was nowhere in 1980 has vaulted to the top. Its economy has doubled every 7 years. For every 2-year period since 2008, the extra growth in its economy, just the extra, has been larger than the entire economy of India. Last year, China created a Greece every 16 weeks, or an Israel every 25 weeks. In 2004, China's economy was 50% that of ours here in the United States. By 2014, it was roughly equal. By 2024, they should be 50% greater than ours. The world's manufacturing powerhouse, it has surpassed the United States as the largest producer of ships, steel, furniture, textiles, cell phones, and computers. Exports in 1980 were just 8% that of the United States. Today they're already 150%. And China's story isn't just that of its exports. Growth at home in terms of consumption has been no less astonishing. America was the birthplace of the automobile. China is now the largest automaker, and its people bought 20 million cars last year. That's 3 million more than were sold here in the United States. The IMF annual report for 2015 recorded China's economy alongside, for the first time, that of the United States. And if affected like all of us by 2008, their rate of growth has slowed to 7%, it still remains far beyond the 4 to 6% achieved by Britain at its zenith in the 19th century, and miles ahead of our virtually stagnant performance during the last few years here in the United States. Let me try to put a dynamic on this emerging force, give you a sense of what this means in the context of us here. I read daily in that great journal, the New York Times, of the many years overrun in improving the city's subway system. To date, no one in the 10 years I've lived in the United States has done anything about its decaying infrastructure. We have no high-speed rail system. Our air traffic management is collapsing. The housing stock in our and Europe's inner cities is threatening the very fabric of society. Compared to China, we're standing still. Between 2011 and 2013, just 3 years, China produced and then used more cement than the United States did in the entire 20th century. In 2011, one Chinese construction company built a 42-story skyscraper in 15 days. In 2014, it built a 57-story skyscraper in just 19 days. China has built the equivalent of Europe's entire housing stock in just 15 years, whilst Europe's leaders have failed to work out even the basics of how to optimize their own combined and, in their minds, advanced economies. The bridge over Boston's Charles River has been under construction ever since my son graduated from Harvard 4 years ago. That's 4 years in Boston, one of the nation's beacon cities. In the early winter last year, Beijing replaced the far larger Samyang Bridge not in 4 years. It did it in 43 hours. China has now the world's most extensive and modern highway system, and it has the longest high-speed railway network, enough to link our east and west coasts twice over. It has more high-speed track than the rest of the world combined. During this same period, California has been struggling to complete a single 500-mile connection between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Projected to finish by 2008, the most recent date is 2029, with an expected overrun of $35 billion. Despite all this achievement, China makes mistakes. Its one-child policy has led to a surfeit of 100 million young males without the prospect of a girlfriend, to an explosion of prostitution, and to the threatening prospect of large numbers of frustrated, testosterone-driven youths all over the place. The army for World War III right off the bat. Poverty remains a massive challenge, but it's becoming more tractable with every passing day. Average per capita income was just $193 in 1980, and today it's over $8,000. $500 million have been lifted out of poverty. Life expectancy has doubled to 76. 95% are literate. China rates 6th in the world in mathematics. We're 39th. Stanford University, by any measure, one of our leading universities, estimates that Chinese high school STEM graduates arrive with a 3-year advantage over their American counterparts in terms of critical and creative thinking skills. And in all this, never forget the ever-present factor of scale. China graduates 5 times as many STEM students as the United States each year. 1.6 million as against 300,000. That's 1.3 million more each year. This is not a brain drain. This is a brain flood. Forget the soulless, individual-crushing communism of Lenin, Stalin and Putin. Forget the madness of Mao. Today, China is introducing communist consumerism. They're minting a new billionaire each week. And though they save on average 30% of their incomes, Chinese shoppers bought last year half of the world's luxury goods sold. For Louis Vuitton, for Chanel, Gucci, Sotheby's and Christie's, China is the primary customer. A final factoid for you. In 2013, the White House singled out supercomputers as essential to our economic and scientific development. Since that year, the fastest supercomputer has been not in Silicon Valley but in China. It's 5 times faster than its closest United States rival and is built entirely with domestic processors. This is no lucky happenstance. China's stated strategy is to dominate the artificial intelligence market by 2025. I'm well aware this review is a partial one. no reference to civil liberties, to censorship, to the millions still living in poverty, to whether we trust their legal system, or to the social costs of forced migrations to make way for power stations, railways and roads. But then I'm not trying to give you a multidimensional view of the nation in all its complexities. I'm trying to set the scene for China's potential impact on us in the West. This is a polemic, a warning. In particular, I'm seeking to introduce at least an alternative way of thinking. Theirs is a managed economy where government owns some 80% of its national assets, where it has ready control over what its companies do or do not do, and has already set in hand a sophisticated foreign policy founded on geoeconomics, the route to a new form of coexistence that governments in the West simply do not comprehend, that they largely denigrate, and they are largely not set up to resist. By sophisticated, I mean complex. China's geoeconomic strategy is not one of simple friendly gifts, tokens of goodwill and harmony. There is some of that. But in reality, their geoeconomic strategy is in part, the first steps in an economic war. The manipulation of trade to bend the will of neighbour states whilst retaining constructive relations. We here still depend upon the fragmented private sector, on short-termism, on the individual, and we are suspicious of centralised anything. Even public-private partnerships are seen as defying our past. We resist updating our political structures. We're constitutionally unadaptive. Our state institutions resist change, even though they're increasingly derided as do-nothings. We view foreign policy largely through the prism of military action. But today and outside the United States, it is governments and not private shareholders who own the world's largest assets, including the 13 largest oil and gas firms and 75% of the world's energy reserves. I've already said that state-backed companies account for 80% of China's stock market. By the way, they account for 62% of Russia's and nearly 40% of Brazil's. Sovereign wealth funds, a term first coined just 12 years ago, now hold 50% of the world's reserves. So how does this geoeconomic warfare play out? Let me give you an example and then bring the challenge up to today. Japan was responsible in the 1930s for the repulsive savaging of Nanking and eastern China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Horrors that will never be forgotten and will always be a focus of China's hatred. Retribution will come. Today, Japan is an important ally of ours in our administration of our Asian interests. But we have been almost powerless to find a way of containing this Chinese hatred. Throughout the last decade, and with increasing edge, China has cut trade flows to Japan amid political disputes. In 2001, Japan's then Prime Minister visited the Yasukuni War Shrine that includes homage to convicted war criminals. The year was especially sensitive following testimony about new evidence that Japan had systematically tested germ warfare on captured Chinese men, women and children. Beijing responded by cutting the quotas for Japanese car imports by 60%. 5 years later, revised Japanese history books glossed over the Nanking atrocities, and China engineered a boycott of Japanese imports, clamped down on import controls and visa approvals, and stopped Chinese tourism to Japan. China's current pursuit of control of the China seas and the potential oil reserves there have been supplemented by cutting off supplies to Japan of rare earth oxides, rare earth salts, and rare earth metals. I told you we'd get back to rare earths sooner or later. These are crucial to Japanese electronic component manufacture and also crucial to the US high-tech supply chain. The rare earth ban of 2013 marked a coming of age of China's use of geoeconomics. It was the first time it had so boldly coerced an US ally, rather than use military threats. It sent a strong message against Japan's maritime claims, and it forced some Japanese companies to relocate to China to ensure their rare earth supplies. Thereby, in addition, China won several more hostages to fortune in the future, enhanced its capacity for economic leverage over Japan, and it signalled its indifference to the United States. And here's the point. China has built its ability to threaten and cajole on all fronts without taking the far more dangerous step of saber-rattling, let alone that of sending in troops, risking lives, talking about bombs and red lines, or facing the inevitably difficult global PR and the ultimate waste of treasure of an all-out attack. China's central control allows it to flex its soft muscles at will. And now this game of geoeconomic chess has ratcheted up on the back of its growing strength and confidence at home. China is turning its attention to economic-led power on a continental dimension. If the British and United States hyperpowers were created off the back of war economics, as I've argued elsewhere, then assuredly One Belt, One Road, or OBOR, introduced by President Xi at the end of 2013, is the start of geo, or soft war, economics. Building on China's grand history, it is recreating the Silk Road of 1,000 years ago in a 21st century idiom. By doing this, it is manoeuvring the countries along the way into a co-opted collaboration on an historic scale. This strategy is at heart the largest and longest-term generational bid to grow neighbouring economies, to underpin home commerce, and to create a Eurasian trade alliance that will benefit China's ambitions over the next generation. It involves its own Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is fast overshadowing the World Bank. 900 infrastructure projects, more than $1 trillion, roughly the equivalent of 12 Marshall Plans. This is a long-term strategic power grab based on soft muscle to stretch from the China Seas through Pakistan and India, down the east coast of Africa and across north and west to the Mediterranean and to Europe and its weakening economies. The planned projects are vast, and they're not random. They're focused on infrastructural transformation, ports, rapid transit systems, power stations, roads. They benefit brother nations in desperate need of both the funds and the skills. And of course they provide work for the growing skilled workers of China. They use the steel and cement produced in China, and they're co-funded by China's growing list of public-private partnerships. OBOR to the outside world will project the virtues of Chinese technology and benevolence across several continents. By 2025, they will cut the time to move freight from Beijing to Rotterdam from 1 month to 2 days. And California's much-needed little high-speed rail links will still not be completed. China is set to re-establish the place it held twice before As its paramount leader, Xi Jinping told a gathering of Europe's leaders recently, "In the final analysis, I tell you, it is for the people of Asia to run the affairs of Asia, to solve the problems of Asia, and to uphold the security of Asia." And this is happening already. We're experiencing a virtual economic blitzkrieg in the last 2 years. Here are the land-based corridors of the new Eurasian Concordat, echoing the historical Silk Road and the massive sea corridor through Singapore to the Mediterranean. 60 countries, led by the new China. This is geoeconomics on a generational scale, what I've called soft muscle, and possibly a recipe for successful world coexistence. But much of that will depend on our ability here in the United States to come to terms with the new power on the block, to learn new tricks of mutually beneficial accommodation. And this will not be easy. The One Belt, One Road policy asserts China's ownership of the South China Seas. It has well in hand construction projects, ports, airstrips, radar facilities and so on throughout the Spratly Islands, and it's rapidly rebuilding its military, the final component, its big stick. Xi has stated his intention to rebuild the country's historic place in the world. Never again do they intend to back down as they did in 1996 when Clinton's 2 aircraft carriers forced China to curtail missile testing around Taiwan. In preparing for this talk, I was helped enormously by the work of Graham Allison, founding dean and director of the Harvard Kennedy School for International Affairs, who has written that China's military shopping list was predictable weapon systems to ensure that if such a confrontation with the United States as in 1996 happens again, Beijing will prevail. Today, he says, its arsenal of anti-ship missiles on the mainland and in its coastal fleet make it impossible for the United States to operate within 1,000 miles of China's coast. And as we are seeing every day, China's centralized strategic grip is enabling it to focus hitherto unimaginable quantities of sovereign funds on achieving a world lead, not just on infrastructure, but also in AI and in quantum computing. Whilst the United States, stuck in yesterday's inadequate straitjacket of small government and private sector thinking, is relying on companies like Google and Microsoft to lead the way, the world's largest power is making it their national focus. So what's to be done? Well, this talk is above all designed to start a debate. As a Brit, I'm especially conscious that this is your challenge, and critical outsiders like me can become unwelcome very quickly. Before setting the ball rolling, however, a word about Britain's own blindness. In 1897, Arnold Toynbee was writing about the Diamond Jubilee celebrations of Queen Victoria, Empress of India, ruler of the British Empire. "Here we are," he wrote, "on top of the world. We've arrived at the peak to stay forever." And then he added, with an uncanny combination of prescience and myopia, "There is, of course, that little thing called history. But history is something unpleasant that happens to other people." Within 3 years, the United States had overtaken Britain in economic terms. Within 17, we were all at war. So, given the thickness of the mud in the Washington swamp, is it worth starting a debate? I suggest we have little alternative. Quantum computing, for example, will render all our current cyber defences redundant. And why should your governors not take some of their own medicine. I hear on all fronts about how workers now need to be able to transform themselves several times during their careers. Can this great nation and its politicians not transform their own thinking and attitudes in the same way? Can they really not put their shoulder to the honourable wheel of truly reviving America? Well, before some closing remarks, let me tell you we must, we can, and by my life, if only we clung a little more proudly to our great history, we would know we've done it before. Not once, but twice in living memory. In 1940, though much of the country was isolationist, insular, xenophobic, at Roosevelt's call, Big Bill Knudsen left General Motors to be joined by shipbuilding magnate Henry Kaiser to corral, cajole, and inspire business leaders across the country to mobilize the arsenal of democracy. This would make possible the Allied victory. In less than 12 months, they turned auto plants into aircraft factories, civilian assembly lines into fountains of munitions. And they transformed your army from a hollow shell into a global force and laid the foundations for the nation's emergence as the hyperpower of the 50s. And what is more, you did it again. This time just 60 years ago, even I can remember it. Challenged by Russia's shock launch of the Sputnik, people questioned our education system, industrial strength, our science and technology. Within a year, you established NASA and directed space research into public-private collaboration. You poured billions of dollars into science, mathematics, and engineering education, and within 12 years, we had put the first man on the moon. Ladies and gentlemen of America, if you can do that, you can do anything. So, and remember, this is still a Brit talking, just trying to set the ball rolling. What's to be done? Well, here's my little list to start you off. First, the overwhelming priority. Re-establish economic strength at home and put into effect those obvious changes that will improve your competitiveness. Set the target of 5% GDP growth per annum within 2 years. Repatriate the trillions held abroad by United States companies every year at a one-off low interest rate, a welcome home rate. And ensure that the monies are invested rapidly here in the United States into R&D, into improved productivity, or into infrastructural regeneration programs run centrally or on a state-by-state basis via a new public-private cooperative. Get real. You're in a new world. You're competing with sovereign funds, so focus economic guns of an equivalent force. Secondly, take a grip on the critical issue of talent. Invest in education for all. Go back to our history of open borders and tolerance, but with a pragmatic twist of entry focused on the elite, on merit, and value added from any newcomer. Thirdly, here's a thought. Create the Americas continental bloc. You could call it the Road of the Americas. The US priority is surely to optimize its close relations, its mutual markets, and to encourage economic growth and coexistence throughout its own backyard, from Greenland in the north through Canada, Mexico, and south to Brazil and Argentina, where, by the way, most of the world's future hoard of lithium resides. Taken together with their huge coastlines, their vast natural reserves, and their large populations, here are markets and geo-economic opportunities that belong to you, not to China or to the Russians. So build on them, optimize them, make them your own. Fourthly, create a new concordat to work with OBOR, to share the future with China as a partner, and to build on each other's shoulders to create a better world for all, as well as bigger markets for you too. And finally, isolate Russia. Unflaggingly limit its malevolence. Whatever you do, however you wish you could react differently, the one thing I urge you now is not to walk away, not to find ways of sidelining this warning and denigrating China. Unlike Britain at the turn of the 20th century, the United States has a shot at an extended stay at the top throughout the 21st century, if only it will confront the realities of today. As I researched and wrote this talk, I noticed with increasing clarity how far this great nation had drifted from its compass. The only thing that will stop the transformation will be the extent to which you have forgotten the spirit that made this nation in the first place. The spirit of 1940, the leadership of a Roosevelt, the genius of your great businessmen then, and the vision that you got and got you to the moon. Of course, what you do is really up to you to debate. But I also noticed with increasing clarity each day how China's new economics were already impacting the world. I read, for example, of the billions of dollars being invested into the historic Greek port of Piraeus. Europe and the United States see Greece as a southern and eastern state on the edge of their sphere of interest, an economic basket case, and we raise punitive interest rates accordingly on our loans. But China sees Greece as a gateway into Asia's European peninsula, an opportunity to invest into the underbelly of the rest of Europe. Those are not my words, they're the words of the Greek Prime Minister and President Xi last week. No one seems to have noticed how in the last 12 months China has transformed Piraeus into the busiest port in the Mediterranean, how it's been designated as the future maritime entry point for China's One Belt, One Road, and how massive bets are already being made on bringing China tourists to a revitalized ideal of ancient Greece, built near Athens, itself one of history's former hyperpowers. Instead, China is still dismissed by many in government as a rogue state. The challenge for the United States will be to transform this thinking, to transform its timescales, and to transform its understanding of the new economics that China is investing with such purpose.